Welcome. Thank you everyone for managing to the very last session of this week's IASA, this year's IASA. This is the plenary of the exec, organized by myself and Mariya Ivancheva. You've seen the title. I won't repeat the title, but I'll pull out a few key words. It's about decolonial and post-socialist struggles against established forms of knowledge. I think both Mariya and I came to this panel from similar perspectives, but also bringing in our own views, our own histories with anthropology. For me personally, I came to anthropology late. For those of you who know me, you'll know that my background is international relations. My focus was always on issues of power and migration. And I was always attracted to anthropology, and I started working in anthropology quite suddenly and unexpectedly when I was hired in the department. And I have I've had a strong attraction to anthropology and what it can do and what it might do, as well as a certain frustration with a canon. When I've often felt, and being very subjective and personal here, I've often felt anthropology fails to live up to its promise. I feel that sometimes anthropology, with its when it should be focusing on the marginal, when it should be thinking about relations of power that consign groups and ways of thinking and knowing to the marginal, that sometimes becomes itself marginal to the enterprise. So anthropology has a tendency, I think, to reinvigorate its canon and the ways of seeing and the ways of knowing that that come from very specific type of canon. And one of the things I think that happens here is that the margins sometimes either become incorporated in ways that reinvigorate the core. They become, for example, moments of a multicultural slot, where the relations of antagonism, the relations of conflict that are central to the world and to anthropology as a discipline become somehow reinvigorate, somehow used by the core to reinvigorate itself. And one of the things I think that we're trying to do here is to try to speak once again from the margins to the core. But it becomes important that as we speak from the margins, we see the canon as a historically emergent way of seeing, understanding, and making sense of the issues that concern us as anthropologists. What we hope that we strive for in this panel and other forms of discussions is denaturalization of the canon. So what we try to do in this particular session, I think, is to try to speak to the canon, against the canon, from different histories, different regions, different ways of seeing and knowing. And we're really pleased, Mariya and I, to have 4 really interesting speakers. What I want to do is very briefly introduce the 4 of them. They'll have a chance to introduce themselves shortly, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. So we'll have Margit Feischmidt, who's a research chair and head of the research department, at the Institute for Minority Studies at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Her work focuses on the study of ethnicity, race, migration, and populism in Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly on Hungary, and how all of these issues intertwine. Margit is also the editor-in-chief of what I think is a really groundbreaking journal, Intersections, East European Journal of Society and Politics. Then we have Rosana Pinheiro Machado, who is lecturer at the University of Bath. Rosana is a scholar of globalization and inequality, focusing on emerging economies, specifically Brazil and China, with a focus on studying long-durée processes of global structuring that impact on emerging economies. Then we have Mary Taylor, who is Assistant Director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Mary works at intersections of populism and aesthetics and nationalism, also particularly in Hungary, but also more broadly in Central and Eastern Europe. Then we have Nora El Qadim, who is faculty member at the Political Science Department at University Paris 8. Her work focuses on the governance of borders and migration, and in particular on EU-Morocco relations and post-colonial challenges to border infrastructures. I want to say just a quick word about how we're going to do this. We'll start shortly with Mariya's take on the panel itself and the plenary itself, and then we'll have short presentations from each of the speakers. We really would like to make this as dialogic as possible. Please do use the chat. Use the chat to indicate if you have questions. Put a few keywords in the questions if you in the chat if you could, and I'll be monitoring the chat and we'll call you up onto the stage itself to interact with the panelists. Okay, and I hand over to Mariya first.
Thanks a lot, Prem, for this. And I just, on the last note, so we would try after 2 rounds of short interventions by the panelists to open it to you. And the idea would not be that you pose questions that then the panelists respond to, but that we think of all of you and all of us as part of this dialogue and as participants that have something to contribute on it. So we would want to hear your statements, your reactions to the way that we phrased it, to the topics that emerge from the talks, from your own research, from the things that worry you. So please, don't only think of it in this format of question answer, even if we are in this very undemocratic space of the online media, despite all the democratization that's been promoted to us through it. So this panel, you might, one thing that is strange about it is it's such a mouthful of a topic, right? So there's so many words in it. And there's so many words because in a way, we were almost handed the topics that we were hoping to see spread more evenly across not the small sections and not the small panels, but the other plenaries, the keynotes, the other spaces at this conference. At the end, there is they were touched upon, of course, but we were left with a lot. And in this, we are trying to work through peripheries on a few levels. For peripheries of Europe, and we're speaking of the Eastern European and Southern European periphery where we should have been, but also colonial peripheries and peripheral spaces within the core of Europe. So, to bear this kind of dialect in mind, we are speaking of peripheries within anthropology as a discipline and of academia. And I think, and then peripheries of academia and peripheries of society in terms of engaged scholarship. So a lot of the topics that come in today actually used to be quite peripheral and nobody was paying attention. And out of a sudden, we have to deal with these topics as very central. And whereas it's great that we are finally dealing with decoloniality and solidarity again, the fact that a lot of our speakers are actually focusing a lot on authoritarianism because it's taken so much, it sucks so much of our oxygen is very concerning for all of us. But also, what I think is important to think of is that you're not seeing a panel like a plenary with probably the big names of anthropology, the kind of VIPs that usually come to these kind of spaces. You're seeing 4 early to mid-career anthropologists that are themselves in many ways on the margins of academia or on the margins of the discipline or in a kind of strange relation, which I hope that they're going to be speaking about. And it is interesting because when we were interacting with each one of them, they somehow didn't believe that they were invited to something like this because people in these positions usually don't end up in these spaces. So that's something I think important to reflect upon. We did have COVID-19 that pushed us into this weird space, which at least we tried through Zoom to kind of bring them on stage, but we do hope to make the most out of the technology, but that you do apologize us for that. And then I think the last thing that I want to say before, we are going to be dealing with silences. We're going to dealing with something that yesterday was articulated like class war within academia. So we are already at the place where we can't pretend that the conflict is somewhere else. It is in our own home in many ways. And we have to kind of start dealing with this conflict face on and not pretend that the aggressors and the aggressed can both be done justice, that we can suit both the powerful and the marginalized, and that is a gesture of justice. And I think in this also, like bringing up the colonial and decolonial history, I think it's important to think not just of race, but of racism, and of modes in which capitalism produces racialized bodies through labor process, through process of extraction, and to think of how these spaces are engaged in our discipline, and do we even manage to engage properly given our own colonial burdens that are still like not just ghosts in the closet, but they are still many times taking the key hubs of knowledge production within the discipline. So on that note, I would like to ask our speakers to actually speak about their research. So we have produced with Prem and with the help of the other exec members kind of, quite a few topics that they could relate to. We did not expect that all of them are going to relate to each one of them, but we did ask for this first question to see how they relate to some of these problems, how their research has reflected some of this problematic, and what sense they have been making out of it with their research and engagement.
Thank you for inviting me for this prestigious panel. And I will try what was mentioned by Mariya to link somehow our co-topics, not only to the precedents and my own work, but also what I heard, what I was able to attend in the previous days concerning the topics which are included also in our today last panel. Plenary, under Gingrich, ascertained that most of the core elements of a new nationalism defined in 2005 had by then emerged more clearly. As various recent papers claim, everyday discourses were signaling even before the appearance of the institutionalized forms of neo-traditionalism and neo-nationalism that belonging for certain groups and certain circumstances was beginning to be framed in ethno-racial terms and was focused on othering. Nevertheless, as Gingrich also mentioned, important features of new nationalism and the accompanying political phenomena had changed in the meantime. The neo-nationalist phenomenon was no longer primarily located only among those few small and affluent countries and losers of a globalizing world in which it had first re-emerged during the 80s and 90s. In its various forms, it had moved from the periphery to the centers of power and society. What does anthropology play in understanding these changes, the new and recurrent forms of nationalism, and the radical and mainstreaming practices of the far right? This is the question that I will address, reflecting on certain points in the literature and my own work in this area. Connected to the main question, the role of anthropological methods and of ethnography especially will be examined. I'm interested in how anthropology discusses the nature, the causes and consequences of the nationalist and authoritarian turn in East Central Europe, and how the results from the region enter global discussions. Although we know how important anthropology is in analyzing social relations and cultural practices which have generated an increasing responsiveness towards the far right and acceptance of the illiberal turn, empirical studies of the far right and of populist and authoritarian regimes are few. Authors, including conveners of the panel on methods, ethics, and politics of anthropology of the populist far right at this conference, explain this by pointing to problems of access, which involve not only the unwillingness of participants of the far right to talk to scholars, but also the hesitance of scholars to attend to the life work of the so-called unlikable others. Nonetheless, there are some important lessons from this scholarly work that are important to review so we can move on. Anthropological investigation often takes into account the approach of the far-right and neo-fascist movements and activists, or pays special attention to the cultural aspects of those groups, considering them as political subcultures. Reading the current literature, one may also recognize that there is a specific emphasis on local investigations into the far right. The study of the advance of the far right on the local level can be explained not only by the fact that its support tends to be heavily concentrated in specific localities, but also in relation to the specific methods that anthropologists innovatively apply. Local case studies bring to the surface invisible connections through other methods, but also allow the use of special combinations of a variety of social and cultural analytical approaches. When I was working together with Kristóf Szombati in Gyöngyöspata, one of the Hungarian villages where the far right came to local power in early 2010, we found that the rise of the far right could be explained not only by structural factors, but also by the role of local political events and agencies, in this case, an anti-Roma field campaign that allowed far-right actors to mobilize Hungarian peasants, but also by certain discourses. While incorporating the significance of symbolic work and relative autonomy of the cultural domain, we also stressed the need to contextualize processes unfolding within this realm. This claim resonates with findings from Douglas Holmes' fieldwork in rural Italian communities affected by recent waves of modernization. Holmes' key argument is that rural communities may increasingly reach back to tradition in an attempt to mend ruptures in their sense of belonging in a rapidly changing and increasingly insecure world. In a further investigation in 3 multi-ethnic villages affected by the far right, I looked for the local forms and sources of everyday nationhood perceptions. I found that Hungarianness is mainly accessible through discourse about the Roma. Thus, similar to the power relations between racially marked subalterns and unmarked dominant groups, or the dichotomy of the colonized East and the colonizing West, Gypsy can be a culturally, morally, and more frequently racially marked category of the subaltern that has Hungarian as its unmentioned conceptual antithesis, and which constructs the idea of Hungarianness as a superior and hegemonic position of power. The exposure of everyday discourses of belonging to the far right was also demonstrated by Paul Memchen, who ethnographically examined how resistance to plans for the large-scale restructuring of a district in Amsterdam was embraced by a nationalist discourse and populist politics. He demonstrated that Dutch populism rests on a culturalized and ethnicized construction of, quote, ordinary people as autonomous, while the white racism of the far right offers categories and idioms in which to speak about one's sense of displacement. It is not only discourses, but also the performances and symbols which characterize far-right political communities that can be understood in terms of culture. As 2 of the conveners of the previously mentioned panel of this conference, Alexander Harder and Benjamin Opratko, put it, Rather than focusing on voting preferences or political attitudes, the term culture of rejection allows us to introduce anthropological perspectives for understanding social cultural conditions of right-wing populism's current success. In an earlier paper on popular culture and the far right that I wrote together with Gergő Pulai, we showed how the return to nationalism and its connection to far-right politics have transpired through subcultures. We claimed that a nationalist popular culture played a leading role in the emergence of the political and symbolic language of extreme right politics. As Cynthia Miller-Idris notes, approaching the far right in the culture space means, on the one hand, unfolding what attracts youth to the culture components of the far right, but attracts them to far right music, festivals, or consumer products, and on the other, paying closer attention to the production and appropriation of symbols, images, and subculture scenes. A long-term commitment and closer relationship to the field permits anthropologists to go beyond the ideological cliches of the actors they research. Agnieszka Pasieka persistently writes about illuminating the fact of studying the activities of the far-right groups, emphasizing in her latest publications how the latter work as caring communities. Moreover, our analyses have shown the importance of specific landmark events, which according to Mabel Berezin, we may understand as bringing about a durable transformation of structures. Finally, the ethnographic perspective makes personal agency comprehensible and brings us closer to understanding individual and collective emotions. Scholars of the far right and right-wing populism, including Sindre Bangstad and his co-editors, have discussed the importance of effects in the suspension of liberal illusions about rational and deliberative democratic polities. That was a quote from Sindre. Once again, citing Andre Gingrich, it is precisely at this interface between local social emotions and mediatized ideologies of anger and fear where the fieldwork and analysis of anthropologists are required. This was also my aim when I became committed to understanding the reasons for the spread of fear and the suspension of solidarity in the securitizing Hungarian context. Complementing studies that looked at the structural factors affecting the politics of fear on a macro level, our ethnographic investigation in a village on the Hungarian-Serbian border was monitoring the construction of the hegemony of fear instrumentalized by securitizing far-right actors. Let me conclude by returning to and answering the first part of my initial question. When combined with an analytical effort involving historical, socio-economic, and political contextualization, ethnography represents the best chance to untangle the rise of the far right by linking an analysis of localities, events, and processes unfolding on the micro level. Nevertheless, the second part of the question, which addresses when the radical and populist right is not the exception or understandable only in concrete groups and localities, but is metaphorically everywhere, hence characteristic of the public mainstream, is harder to answer, and I leave this open for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariya. And I'd like to ask Rosana.
Thank you, Margit.
Margit, sorry, Margit. Rosana.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this panel. It's a great to be here today in these challenging times. I'd like to thank Mariya, Prem, and the organizers of EASA for the opportunity to share my work with you and to start a discussion in this engaging panel. So my comments today discuss how anthropologists from non-core regions like Brazil contribute to the understanding of the new radical right. I also attempt to answer whether this political phenomenon is threatening the very existence of anthropology. So my argument is that anthropology is a core discipline in the scholarship of the radical right. The type of long-term, community-based, detailed knowledge produced by ethnographers is more relevant than ever. It offers a unique opportunity of renewal of the discipline. At the same time, it poses new challenges to the canon. So the first time that my research partner, Lucy Skalk, and I publicized our ethnography among voters of Jair Bolsonaro in a favela in Brazil, the public reaction was very negative. This was in 2016. We could not imagine that the backlash from progressive and anthropological circles. We were witnessing how far-right gained little by little engagement among ordinary low-income people. But the mainstream academia said that we were inventing a phenomenon that was insignificant. Some of our peers suggested that we were giving voices to monsters and humanizing fascists. So as we know, anthropology emerged through the study of the most vulnerable groups in the world system, promoting translation of categories and the meanings, arguing in favor of the full humanity and the essentialist attributes and the complexity of the other. Although the study of non-vulnerable, it is not new in our discipline at all, anthropologists in the 21st century are increasingly facing the challenge of studying the enemy, the people we tend not to like, those who act against diversity, human rights, and fundamental principles of justice upon which our discipline is structured. Those who ultimately threaten the existence of the discipline. So in this context, should we simply give up our humanizing and anti-essentialist professional commitment? Our fieldwork complexifies even more these questions. So what happens when the line between the horrendous fascist and the vulnerable native becomes increasingly blurred? What happens when we notice that the enemy and the oppressed are the same, exactly the same subject? So I'd like to share with you the story of Milton, one of our key interlocutors, whose life was marked by extreme poverty. He acquired his first house in 2012 under the Workers' Party and Lula administration. He was an example of the new consumer of the Lula era. He was a generous community leader, he was a good guy, but in the peak of the social crisis in 2015, drug dealers expelled his family from the new house, from the house that he had just bought, and took it for themselves. In 2018, Milton became a passionate Bolsonarist, a Bolsonaro supporter, because he believed that the country needed the authority and the radical change. He now despised Lula as a corrupted leader. 2 years after the election of Bolsonaro, Milton is now disappointed with Bolsonaro's measures to fight coronavirus. So if you have done our ethnography only in times of Milton's support for Lula or Bolsonaro, it would be easy to freeze him in opposite stereotypes, namely the good and the bad native. In times of Lula, media reports celebrated new consumer citizens like Milton as the subjects that symbolized Brazil as an emerging democratic country. If you had not returned to the field, Milton would have remained fixed upon the time as the empowered poor, meeting social expectations about the desired poor. Alternatively, if you had done our fieldwork only in times of the elections, it would have been simple to frame Milton as the new fascist. The fact that the good and the bad poor were the same subject is disturbing. It complicates matters, and we must face ambiguous individuals. One of the anthropological lessons for the study of the far-right wing in the long term is to understand how rage and fear is sedimented how they are sedimented as a process. It is an emotion that gains robustness silently over time. While some part of the public debate reproduces essentialist views about the fascist nature of the Brazilian working class, the anthropological responsibility to the public remains to denaturalize attributes attached to various human groups. The support for authoritarian politicians is a process that responds to political, social, and economic cycles. So let me go back to Milton. I am not arguing in favor of neutrality or a naive relativism. I am a left-wing activist, and every time I returned from the field with Lucy Scalco, my colleague, I cried desperately. I used to witness my friends and interlocutors supporting Bolsonaro, a man whose regime constantly harassed me, and the scholars like me threatened my life and ultimately propelled me to leave Brazil. The point here is to suggest that anthropology reminds us that anthropology in the end is about the dynamic of human life, not about fixity. We cannot split Brazil or the US or the UK or the Philippines into two societies, unfortunately. We cannot rid of those who supported authoritarian projects. So there is no dialogue with supremacists, with extremists, with far-right activists and fascists for sure. But if you want to recover Brazilian or from elsewhere democracy, we need to find the grounds of a common vote and dialogue with those who remain open to change. We need to dispute democratic values among those people who have not radicalized yet. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosana. I also see people are asking a lot of very interesting questions. We're keeping track of them. We'll them. And now we turn to Mary.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to Mariya and Prem for developing this important set of questions and putting together this panel and inviting me. Thanks to Rohan for making the tech work. And thanks to the rest of you for hanging in through the contingencies of an online conference and sticking with us until the end. I have to warn you, I'm going to look to the side a little bit as I present because I'm working with two machines here. Back in 1999, David Scott urged us to impose historicity on our understanding of the rationalities that organize the forms of the colonial state by taking a closer look at particularities in Europe. If the first EASA conference in 1990 sought to unify Europe on the occasion of the collapse of Europe's state socialism or the end of the Cold War, today we might be better poised to see how the Europeanization of the Eastern Bloc produced certain hierarchies and realigned solidarities. As Eastern Europe became the periphery of Europe come the EU, it came to be seen as doubly backwards, the sad bearers of the legacy of a socialist experiment overturned by history itself and terribly out of fashion, and an essentialized symbol of the dark underbelly of Europeanness, what is now being called populism and illiberalism. I want to address the question of how anthropologies can contribute to the understanding of new forms of nationalism and populism, as well as the authoritarian regimes from the perspective of my research in Hungary and Romania and Eastern Europe more broadly, as Prem points out. This research I've done for about 20 years has been on the long history of movements seeking to revive Hungarian folk dance and music through the lens of its contemporary wave, drawing on the traditions of political economic anthropology and dance ethnography. I saw in Hungarian folk dance revival a number of modalities or technologies producing something we might call solidarity that I thought were interesting for understanding the production of political personhood, or what I call civic cultivation. Keying into questions of associational life, I came to witness the production of a very embodied but shifting collective memory at the intersection of reproducible forms and their contingent meanings. It thus also shows a historical process of producing the folk, or the people, and how people come to identify with particular political projects and parties. So what does the anthropology of the Eastern periphery of Europe, as the EU, a peripheralizing semi-periphery in the world system, and also the site of significant experiments with state socialism that is also subject to Orientalist valuings, offer to anthropology more generally? When viewed historically, it provides a nuanced view on populism. As the term populism has become the widely used epithet to name things not in line with liberal and neoliberal values and governance in the last decade, I had to work hard to articulate the specificity of one of the important institutional precursors of the contemporary folk revival, a movement in the name of agrarian workers in the interwar period that is translated as populist. Via the word populist, this movement is often made equivalent both to interwar fascism and to the so-called populism of the illiberal and authoritarian Orban regime and its correlates around the world today. The temporal plane across which the agrarian societies of Eastern Europe emerged as a map of nation states reminds us that nation states, the nation and modern nationalism are new phenomena tied closely to the unfolding of a world capitalist system. I've been taught by the region to see ethno-national strife less as an age-old characteristic of a backward Oriental region, but rather as the effect of new rounds of incorporation into capitalism and the contingent class formations. One important lesson for anthropologists is the problematic dichotomy between good and bad forms of nationalism that make it hard for us to reckon with their common bases. To reckon with Eastern Europe and its peripheral relation to the colonial metropole also asks us to see its characteristics as a waiting room of history, even as its populations are interpolated into nations, into Europeanness and whiteness as hegemonic formation. It forces us to grapple with the broken promise of this invitation, and it asks us to consider a more nuanced story. It prompts us to think not in absolute categories, but in ones that are historically and relationally formed between the West and the rest, if you will. The region's experience with state socialism, with all of its flaws and its undermine, offer useful lessons about the effects of neoliberalization and the rollback of social goods. As an avant-garde of neoliberalization in the so-called industrial world, it teaches us a lot about what is happening elsewhere, and perhaps particularly the importance of really listening to critiques of liberalism. As a site of socialist experiments, the region also has much to teach us about what any real socialist or anti-capitalist project would require, and about the processes of racial capitalism that produce whiteness and its others. It prompts questions for reinvigorated internationalisms and the kinds of solidarities they might espouse beyond the categories of Europe or Europeanness. Thanks. That's all for now.
Thank you, Mary. I want to take note that we are getting questions coming in and comments. For those of you who came in late, we will have another round of interventions from the speakers after this, and then we will turn to comments from the floor. And now I'm very happy to ask Nora El Qadim to come on stage.
Thanks, Prem. Well, I would first like to thank Mariya and Prem for organizing this discussion and for inviting me to take part in it. I will speak from the margins of anthropology as a political scientist in international relations, trained in sociology and history, and very interested in anthropology. The focus of my work has been on a set of policies regrouped under the term migration and mobility policies, and which can also be looked at as policies of immobilization. In this field, a lot of interest in anthropological and sociological research has been on people on the move, especially people whose mobility has been made difficult by restrictive migration policies. On the other hand, political science has traditionally been more interested in the state or international organizations in the making of these policies. And the lines of this disciplinary divide between different aspects of the topic have increasingly blurred in the last decade, especially. For me, having made a rather traditional choice in political science to study up, maybe less traditionally so in anthropology, what anthropology has meant for me has been to truly attempt to understand why people in different positions act in the way they act, enact the policies they enact, and in some cases justify them. And this has meant taking seriously the people I encountered in different organizations, in EU settings, in French settings, or in Moroccan settings as well. Ethnographic approaches of the making of migration policies, of their implementation, also leads to focus on anti-migration discourses, more or less openly racist, in a variety of settings besides the far right, so that also shape nationalism, or are shaped by nationalism. First, anthropology has taught me to pay attention to my own positionality in the institutions I have studied. As a French Moroccan woman, how was I perceived by my interlocutors? What did it mean for people who welcomed me in their very white offices in Brussels to discuss the EU's migration policies with me, to tell me that the problem of the southern borders of Europe compared to eastern borders was the migrants coming that way were more visible? And as a side note, it's very interesting for me to discuss with people who study Eastern Europe, which policies are also orientalized in a way, and whose people are also orientalized, but in a different way. What did it mean for a Moroccan diplomat to tell me about the very limited scope of EU policies compared to UN conventions? And what could I make of this? Second, anthropology has taught me through its internal debates, and mostly the attempts to decolonize anthropology given its history. Similarly, in international relations, criticisms of the discipline as colonially constituted have led to debates on decolonizing IR, which main takeaway has been, from my work on migration policies, and to quote John Hobson and Alina Sajed, to exploring the complex landscapes of non-Western agency. I have found in particular that the idea that European countries were imposing migration policies on southern Mediterranean or other countries in what is commonly referred to as the Global South was not a satisfying way for me to understand these policies. Othering of the migrant, but also othering of the diplomacies of countries categorized as illiberal was appeared in this type of understanding of migration policies. And again, it's one of the questions I would have about post-socialist countries, which are seen as the illiberal EU countries, as if all other countries in Europe were the epitome of democracy, and how does that interact with politics inside the domestic politics of these countries? In the same way, sometimes the illiberal countries outside the EU are seen as non-political in a way. The traces of colonization and its categories are still present in policy making, in particular in development policies. The dynamics of relations between former colonizers and former colonized is complex. Taking my interlocutors seriously has meant looking for agency in situations of international domination or hegemony. It has also meant questioning the possibility for Moroccan officials to interact with non-European partners, either international organizations such as the UN or with other countries in the global south, especially in Africa. Finally, it has also meant listening to claims that alongside financial and commercial cooperation, the idea of dignity was central to the negotiations on migration, and to try and understand how the respect for dignity of people on the move could be translated into a sign of international standing for the Moroccan state. The paradoxes of the post-colonial politics of dignity have meant that in parallel to the criminalization of undocumented exit from the country, the Moroccan diplomacy has attempted to foster a common African position of resistance to EU migration policies, most notably on the issue of processing centers or camps. So to conclude, studying migration policies from the periphery brings nuance to the description of international relations, of power or hegemony, and to the understanding of migration policies in the making.
Thank you, Nora. Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for these, for the way you've spoken to these problems and questions that Mariya and I have put together. I think, you know, we've opened up a whole range of different issues and questions about marginality and about its relationship to dominant forms of knowledge and politics. I'd like to shift to a different type of question to put to all of you again, which is about how you think about this question in relation to engaged scholarship. So how do we translate these types of interventions, these types of focus onto the marginalized into, well, in our academic and pedagogical work? What happens when we think practically about this? How do we practically intervene into this? I forgot to mention in the beginning that Rosana has to leave a little bit early, so I'd like to start by asking Rosana to respond to the second set of questions.
Thanks for the question. So now I'm going to discuss my work in a more practical sense, in a more political engaged sense. Studying Bolsonaro voters demanded us to leave the office and dispute narratives. So straight from the field work to the public research impact without publishing our papers. There was no time to wait to publish a paper before going public. Usually we first do the research and then we publish and then we work with research impact. So we didn't have time for that. We had to do an intervention in the public debate. Like many other anthropologists in Brazil, like Isabella Calil, Lucas Bulgarelli, and so many others, we understood that we had no choice but to immerse ourselves in the wild public debate and working, and many of us worked in campaigns for the 2018 elections. Mainstream political scientists were still making the traditional partisan and institutional electoral analysis. While in 2017, 2018, the mainstream political scientists were still saying, still discussing the election of Bolsonaro in traditional terms, in partisan and institutional electoral, through institutional and electoral analysis. While what we had been witnessing on the ground was the opposite, an election of the collapse of the institutional system, relying on emotions during a period of limbo. Anthropology offered unique lenses to understand the Bolsonarism, how rage gained room in people's subjectivity. We insisted in carving our anthropological view in the public sphere. We wrote articles for national and international newspapers, gave interviews to media outlets, engaged in social media, participated in podcasts and TV shows, and not only me, I would say that today most of my Brazilian peers are doing the same. and we gave several talks worldwide. The effort to speak outside of academia was not enough to change, of course, the electoral results, but we achieved surprisingly positive responses after our first, the one that I mentioned before, our first frustrating attempt. In difficult times of repression and authoritarian rule, the overall interest in anthropology has boomed in the last years in Brazil. And there are many Brazilian anthropologists in the audience, so they can confirm if my impression is right or not. And I would say that the discipline is in a privileged position in making sense to understand the Bolsonarism. My own work as a columnist has reached a qualified high audience. My media reports and my articles and my book are read by thousands of people, and I'm just citing this because the students of anthropology must know that there is a large qualified audience all over the world eager for deep and nuanced stories in which they can make sense of their surroundings. Students, they needed to make sense to their parents, to their relatives, to their workmates who voted for Bolsonaro, Trump, Brexit, etc. In my anthropological training at the end of the 90s and early 2000s, I learned that going public could mean producing a kind of less pure anthropology, a kind of subtle colonized message that still persists in our training everywhere. This is even stronger in Europe, of course. But this is changing completely. Students are eager to account for contemporary phenomenon and produce knowledge that responds to the tensions and the contradictions of our time. My overall evaluation, which is a result of dialogues with my peers, is that the future of anthropology depends to some extent on its capacity to embrace engaged and activist anthropology. My colleagues Lucas Bulgarelli and Paula Alegria and I made a literature review about the study of new West social movements, such as the Occupy, the Arab Spring, in the field of anthropology in Brazil. There was a fantastic and impressive boom of theses and dissertations studying the subject in the last decade, most of them written by students who declare themselves to be part of the movements, who mention that they were activists. They were activists and they were part of the movements they studied. To be honest, in a colonized country whose anthropology has been carried out at home, in which we are the natives and the scholars at the same time, engaged anthropology is not new in Brazil at all. On the contrary, it's constitutive of the discipline. But today we have a completely new scenario, a completely new generation in which the activism, the scholarship, and the public presence are merged in a kind of decolonial practice, especially because of this generation is a result of affirmative action that changed the profile of Brazilian students. Of course, this new generation poses new challenges to the discipline and to the canons. And the most urgent question is how to prepare and to protect these scholars and students whose bodies are subject of all forms of violence. In Brazil, scholars of gender, for example, are completely vulnerable, risking to be violated on the streets, risking suffering several forms of abuse and violence by extremists. Academic freedom is threatened in Brazil, and this is one of the worst cases. Brazil is one of the worst countries in the world. And the Brazilian scholars are completely unprotected by institutions. Finally, this new generation of Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Roads Must Fall, Ni Una Menos, is changing the hierarchical nature of anthropology scholarship. This is good news, but it is our responsibility as teachers and as associations like EASA to embrace and to protect these scholars who nevertheless persist.
Thank you, Rosana. Margit?
I'm very sorry. I will be much shorter because my story it's much shorter. I admire the Brazilian anthropologist near whom I can only report there's no boom in social sciences studying political phenomena in Hungary. And I think this is true also about the regions of Central and Eastern Europe. Although it's stronger in certain countries, like anthropology in Poland, it's much more reflective upon the new political phenomena, stronger in other disciplines than anthropology. So I think in certain senses, sociology and political science is more sensitive on these issues. I won't enter in the detail of my story. I just want to tell you that I don't consider myself as an activist scholar. I try to be an active citizen, and I believe that as a social scientist, we have a special moral plus political plus professional obligation of serving our societies to understand what happens with them and to give voice to their repressed aspirations in search of truth and dignity. So this giving the voice of the people who are repressed because they are in the search of truth and dignity. A couple of years ago, I began studying solidarity actions, and together with my colleague Ildikó Zakariás, we identified a dialectic relationship between humanitarian action and politics. And this entails, on the one hand, a process of increasing public awareness and responsibility implied by those activities. On the other hand, humanitarian activism also seemed to be a novel form of giving voice to positions born in reaction to the mainstreaming far right. That we are not alone with this interest, nothing shows better than that the EASA Anthropology of Humanitarianism network, which was founded not even 2 years ago, and got 3 times slots with about 40 lectures at this year's conference. That was my very short intervention.
Thank you, Margit. And I'd like to ask Mary to come on.
I want to keep my comments brief because I would love to have more of a discussion, and I think people have said so many things that are poignant. So I actually want to address actually a comment. Someone mentioned strategic agonism as a way of addressing Rosana's manner of doing research. I'm sorry, the person who mentioned the comment, I don't know your name. As kind of based on Moof's work and as a kind of grounds for dialogue. And so I wanted to start there because it seems to me that, at least in my own work, dialogue is a really important method. And it's something that attaches my kind of the ethnographic method, which is kind of known to anthropology, to my more activist work, which is sometimes known in a kind of art world and sometimes is more known in projects like Lefties, which most people consider an online journal. But dialogue, I think, offers us a way of thinking about what the kind of knowledge production we're doing collectively in a way that is not always understood when we talk about doing, kind of doing ethnographic research and then producing for the academic public. And when we think about dialogue as a kind of intersubjective process, something that Rosana has also written about, it allows us to think about the political connotations of dialogue beyond what we write as formal academic work. And dialogue then opens up the question of intersubjectivity as well as understanding. And I think that one of the things that people are pointing to is this kind of othering of folks who espouse rightist positions or vote for rightist politicians, that it's easier to do if you're not in dialogue with them. And I mean, it's been a painful process for me, as Rosana points out. It's incredibly painful at times, but there's a lot to be learned about the humanity of these people. And as another commenter pointed out, the kind of popular status of many of these people and why they would make these choices. So, yeah, so I think that there's many different modalities that we can have these conversations, and not all of them have to be public facing, you know, and like a kind of objectified form of our research. They can also be dialogues that we have with different groups, or make public in different ways. So I'll just leave as a last example is Legacies, which Mariya herself is also an editor of the online platform Legacies that I work on, which also has a summer school or summer convergence element where we bring together many of the people who also author for Legacies to discuss a kind of internationalist experience across Eastern Europe, to analyze the conditions as well as the ways forward for the movements. And I just want to leave it that although many people might just read this as like a journal, and in that sense, maybe a poorly edited journal because it's got such a diversity of voices to it, I see it as more as a conversation, as a dialogue amongst actors that more or less share a position, but have a lot a lot of disagreements, and through that dialogue, a production of a kind of understanding and potentially a solidarity. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Mary.
And just before giving the word to Nora, I want to say that by now we have a lot of interventions and a lot of questions. And we would need to give a bit of an exercise of Shindig type, in which I would really ask some of you who don't want to come on stage to type their questions in the Q&A, so it's down on your screen. It has to be short. And for the speakers to actually take note of these questions, there's one up now for Rosana, but there might be some more. And then the people who want to come and speak after Nora finishes, to actually write to me or Prem, either privately or write on the chat so that we put you up on stage. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I was reading also Nasreen's question just now. It's really interesting to hear that anthropology is kind of doing well in a way in Brazil, or at least that there's a renewal of interest. In France, there have been repeated attacks by politicians on sociology and anthropology for trying to understand certain phenomena, and mostly radicalization, for example, as trying to legitimize them. And it's interesting that these kind of criticism didn't come when sociology was trying to look at the far right, for example. But just in terms of what does it mean for practical work, for me, maybe I would start from Nasreen's question about what it means to give voice rather than talking on behalf of the marginal people. Could it be to pass the mic or power to talk to people? And I was just wondering what that would mean in academia. And for me, it's not just passing the mic, but it's making sure that people have the opportunity to get there. And so, yeah, just what I had prepared to talk about was really about how I integrate all this thinking in the classroom. I really enjoy teaching, I guess, as many of you, and I teach in a public university that welcomes a diverse set of students. And one class, for example, that I teach, or courses that I teach in particular, are on anti-discrimination policies. And the purpose is for students to go and work, find a job in this field. But of course, you don't want them to just find a job in this field. You want them to interrogate the meaning and potential biases of these policies and to be equipped within their future careers to be able to see what they are doing and how they're doing it, to interrogate it with maybe, I mean, they would be able to see it, but maybe to have tools to analyze it more precisely. So, for example, 1 year I made them do an exploratory walk of the university, and the purpose was to produce recommendations to improve public space, but we also reflected on the appropriation of the feminist tool of analysis of the city by securitizing often racist discourse in certain neighborhoods. But at the same time, we saw that a lot of their recommendations were about, you know, very security oriented, light and so on. They wanted more lights, more safety in the university. Another year, we examined the main collections of the Museum of the History of Immigration in Paris and reflected on how to better integrate the voices of migrants and their descendants in the exhibition. It was interesting because some students suggested that this museum, which is located in a building of the Colonial exhibition of 1931, be purely and simply destroyed. So we worked with that, but also towards formulating other suggestions and towards understanding the dynamics at work within the institution itself and how these dynamics could be maybe influenced or not. So I've been very interested by the panels on decolonizing the museum in this conference. And it's no coincidence that anthropology is addressing this issue, of course. But to come back to this idea of how do we pass the mic, I think understanding that the multiplicity of voices and opinions matter, that they, for example, for students in France, that they do not have to all have the same opinion, either as me or between themselves. It's sometimes difficult in an education system where there's always the idea that there is a right answer to questions. And also to understand the nuances of institutions and the ambiguities of the people that they're going to interact with in order to promote a truly anti-racist agenda or anti-sexist agenda for those. These are the main two interests of the students who study there, whatever the way they choose to do so, whatever way they want to do it.
Thank you, Nora. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mariya.
Yeah, so just now you have, I hope the panelists have taken note of some of the questions, but we are now going to bring up a few of the people in the audience to respond to what they heard from their experience and so forth. And then we might give you a chance to kind of react quickly, especially since Rosana will have to go in something like 25 minutes. So we would start with her. So, but for now, I'd like to ask the participant, I'm now confused because there's the panelists and the attendees, but I would really like to ask the participants in the conference that come on stage now to limit to 2-3 minutes so that more people can speak, please. And Prem, to you.
Okay, we have 2 people coming on stage now. I'm going to put Nasrin on stage if I can manage that properly. It says Nasrin will be rejoining as the panelist. I don't know if that means it kicked her out. No, she's here.
She just has to unmute. Nasrin?
Nasrin, I can unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think my passing the mic worked symbolically. Yeah, actually, thank you, Nora, for addressing my point. Yeah, it wasn't a question. It was a random and a forceful imposition, I would say, despite my imposter syndrome from the being being in such a big platform. What I actually wanted to make the point is that, especially after Rosana's presentation, the vulnerability of the scholars who are doing their work in a very fascist regime, and who are trying their best continuously to be critical, at the same time trying to survive in the situation. That's very difficult. It's not about giving voice to everyone. I mean, it sounds bad, but I'm just saying that it's very important to identify those and their vulnerability, the scholars who are doing anthropology, serious anthropology, critical anthropology. And also Anna said on the chat that we have to listen carefully, listen better. And that's actually my point. I totally agree with Anna that how we can actually listen better. I mean, the whole academia, the way it has been built up, the publications, if we write anything other than English, they are not even counted. There's no point of them. So it's the whole channel of academia is very much Eurocentric and English centric. So this is what I meant to say, that it's passing the mic or passing the power is about their working. I'm from Bangladesh. I work there, and it's even more marginal anthropology than South Asia, because if I say South Asian post-colonial subaltern studies are very famous, they have it's a very critical and very powerful analysis. But also I am even marginal from them on that zone. So it's very important for us. Like we've been doing, I'm in a department in anthropology, which is from 25, it's been 30 years almost, the department. They're doing very good, but it's like we don't publish in English. So these are something I would like to put in this forum. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nasreen. I'd like to invite all the panelists to respond to that if you'd like to. Rosana, maybe we start with you.
Yes, thank you for this very, very interesting and meaningful question. And I've been thinking about this. I think you raised two questions. One is about the vulnerability of scholars, and the other thing is how to give voice for vulnerable scholars. And the first thing I would say is that we don't have the answers yet, because when we see in Brazil, it's a dilemma when we say to students, yes, study anthropology, and yes, study gender, study race, you can do research. At the same time, maybe we are just sending our students to some situation of risk that actually threaten their lives. And but at the same time, we know that visibility is also a form of protection. So connecting our first point about this dilemma of giving voice to vulnerable students, because this is also a process that, okay, we are giving voices, but what we do when the students have their voices heard, actually without any institutional protection. I would say that we don't have any support from Brazilian institutions. I mean, we have some, but all the situation is it's very critical, and we need national and international networks of support. And one thing that should be done is large international networks to support the scholar at risk, to support scholars from Philippines, from Brazil, and from other Latin American and non-European countries, and supporting them to publish and to protect their work. I think that's something amazing happened in the US last year, and I think this could be an example. Someone from the Brazilian Center of Research, they created a large network of support to support Brazilian scholars, and they invited the scholars. So there are many networks of support, and this is fundamental, because because we needed to protect the students. On the one hand, we needed to protect the students, we need to help them to have their voices heard, but at the same time, we need to protect them. And this, nowadays, we can only do that through solidarity and through international and transnational networks. So I think it's...
Rosana, I'm just kind of mindful of the time, and that actually we were supposed to now gather more comments from the audience. So if there are questions or rather comments and interventions, the way that Nasrin did, you know, in the way that like relating and speaking of own experiences, and that's not only to you, but like, so now to say, because Prem said whoever wants to respond, if anybody has from the panelists, maybe Nora can urgently respond, but very quickly, and then we can go back to the audience, because at 35 past, we would give the word to Rosana to respond to all the questions because she has to disappear. So we're kind of running a bit out of time.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Nora.
Yeah, I just want to thank Nasrin for clarifying her point. And first, I would like to mention that there is a program in France to welcome scholars at risk or scholars in exile. So if anyone needs information, please email me. It's called Pause. Yeah, please email me if you don't find it. And the second point is also has been made, I think, in the comments on the site, is that the way we cite and who we cite is very important in this visibility of different types of scholars. And someone also mentioned people in the global south are maybe more active in the media than in some cases in the West. I think it's also just different ways that careers are constructed, that you build your career and your visibility. But in a way, the way some people are not cited, some researchers who don't write in English, for example, are not cited, I think is a renewal of the divide between informers, local informers, and the researcher, the legitimate researcher, and it's really important to address, I think.
I just wanted to bring Mithri Prasad on stage. 1 second. Mithri, I think you're on stage. If you could unmute yourself.
Hi. Hi. Thank you for this wonderful panel. It really resonates with me because I'm from India right now in New York. I was thinking about this. I mean, many of the panelists pointed out that there is this question of liberalism in all of this, and how hegemony is articulated during a right-wing regime. So from the experience of India, I can say that when the right-wing is on the rise, are in power, there is a configuration at the opposite side, which is the old elite. In the case of India, it's Congress and the left, many left parties, including Maoists, coming together and being cornered into defending themselves rather than people. And it seems that, many academics, many activists are finally left to seek constitutional provisions, go to the court, use their networks in the media to put their case up. So this process further pushes them away from this, from having any role in taking back hegemony from the right. So this, I thought, I mean, in the context of repressive regimes, I feel that, you cannot actually bundle all of these processes as liberalism, because liberalism also means that, you have to defend yourself. The defense of free speech, the defense of constitutional rights in itself becomes a project. And how do we tackle this? This is all. Thanks.
Thank you, Mithri. I think that we have Hayal. I'll just put him on stage. Some of you have asked why you can't see people if they come on. If you wish to be seen, those of you who come on stage, you need to enable your camera, okay? But some people don't wish to be, don't wish to have the cameras on. So we're waiting for Hayal. Hayal, you're on stage. If you want your camera on, you can enable it.
Okay.
Or at least enable your voice, because otherwise
okay, I unmuted myself, but it automatically muted. So can you hear me right
yes,
now?
now you're good.
Okay, perfect. So I have a question about the kind of challenges you faced when you share your work mostly with Western audience. Because what I wrote in the comments, so I'm an anthropologist based in the United States, and I work on the implementation of police reforms in Turkey and how the authoritarian party government retooled liberal reforms to regiment its power. But when I returned to the US in early 2017, when, for instance, President Trump got elected, many expected me to share these horror stories from the field, lessons learned from the Turkey, in a way, these cautionary tales to redeem Western democracy. So the one challenge I faced is how to write about the Turkish police without downplaying the Turkish state's violence, but also without exceptionalizing it. Because most of the contradictions I faced, I observed in the field in relation to police reforms were not that much different than the, for instance, racialized policing in the United States. And also considering the countries, non-Western countries that we work on it, they are usually designated as the repugnant others of the ideal liberal political order, either because of their insufficient bureaucracies, violent police, so on and so forth. So how do you balance this tension in your own work, both in academia and activism, when you present your work, both describing the inequalities, injustice that you face, but without orientalizing the countries or actors that you study? Thank you.
Thank you, Hayal. Just a reminder, I think we have time for at least one more person on stage, and then we'll turn to a discussion with the panelists. So I'm going to put Alexandra Owanka on stage.
Hi.
Hi.
It's also okay. I'm seeing more people now. Hello. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed the presentations. I wanted to make a comment to Nora, but not only about studying up or studying interlocutors or topics, interlocutors who have more power than the researchers, or those particular types of interlocutors. For example, in my own work, when looking at as an anthropology of EU policy, I have been always feeling like I need to do whiteness in order to gain access to EU policymakers, and not only. So even though it demanded from me this performative long-term commitment to a certain way of doing that in order to do my research. And in the previous panel, when we were talking about decolonizing European anthropology, together with my co-panelists, like with Armand Gildis, Tiago Pinto Barbosa, and also with Lenita Ruggi, we were talking about this idea that what does it mean to work on whiteness and structures of power in Europe when you are an insider, an outsider, or a liminal European, liminal white, or exactly what does it mean, and what is the potentials and limits of studying up for decolonizing knowledge production, decolonizing polities, but also what are the limits? Could we think of studying up as a sort of as a way how anthropology tries to reform itself, or are there limits to this exercise? And also, I wanted Nora, but also for the others, how was it like for you to do that particular type of research as a person of color, and how did you try to navigate that, and what are your thoughts on that? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Come on.
I think maybe Mariya, would you like to add?
Yeah,
to
I was just thinking something, you know, because I think it's an interesting one, having Alexandra, who is Romanian, so that's quite close to Bulgaria, and who looks very white as I do, speaking about whiteness as if it's something foreign to you, you know, like, and it is an interesting one, right? Because we are kind of undoubtedly white, but within Europe, we're one of these, you know, kind of type of racialized subjects, and not necessarily maybe us as academics, but definitely the workers in the asparagus fields and the strawberry fields that have come recently to serve the kind of consumer in Britain, in Germany, and so forth. And I think one thing that I can say about studying up, like what the time that I really kind of realized some of my privilege to an extent that I didn't, coming from Eastern Europe and going to the West, was when I did as a white woman research in South Africa and at South African universities. And when I realized that there was no one who could stop me, the moment I wanted to get access, I just got access immediately, just by my skin color. I could walk through barriers. I could just drive into whatever I wanted, and nobody would kind of say anything because I had the right to access. And it was, you know, perhaps it didn't, you know, maybe it helped me sometimes, maybe it didn't in studying, but it was really interesting information for me as an anthropologist and as a human body to understand the type of middle class white European privilege, which I've never felt in my life previously in Europe the same way that I did in South Africa. So just wanted to relate to that, maybe to also open it up, because it might not be very comprehensible to folks from other parts of, you know, non-European, you know, or maybe parts of Western Europe that don't understand the way that some of us Eastern Europeans might feel in some situations.
Thank you, Mariya. I think now, just keeping in mind the time, maybe we can turn to Rosana to generally your reflections on what has been said before and any of the questions that have come up in the Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the other panelists as well.
Thank you. I'm really sorry, and I have to go earlier today. I have another important appointment and I have to go. But this was one of the most exciting panels that I attended, and I'm really glad we made it. So thank you so much, everyone. I couldn't focus. So many interesting questions. I just want to address royal questions about the exceptionalism, and this is something that I've been thinking a lot since I'm new here in the UK, and also I was invited to talk about Bolsonaro in the US, and my role is always to talk in the position of a scholar at risk. So that's my role. So and this is really tricky, because they really, people in general, they really expect that I perform that role from a Brazilian anthropologist. But I think the answer, and then I'm going to be very quick, is the good ethnography is the answer. Because when you write a good ethnography, I mean, a real one, and you bring you the stories of ordinary people, we are describing people like we are describing Trump's voters, like Brexit voters, because we are just making sense to a world that's actually much broader than Brazil and many other authoritarian experiences in India or Philippines. So I think that our position is to respect our ethnographical work, and then the solution will come out, because that's the point. The point is that good stories and good ethnography can solve these stereotype that is always attached to us and to our role as scholars from the global south. So I think the answer is bringing real and good ethnography.
Thank you, Rosana. And thank you for coming in. We understand that you have to leave, but please just stay with us as long as you can. Maybe I turn now to Margit. Would you like to respond to any of the questions that have arisen or the discussions that have come from the floor? Margit, you're muted.
Can I say just one thing very quickly? Please, you can find me on social networks, on Twitter, and yeah, so you can easily find me and we can continue this conversation.
I will wait the reflection of the others, because I think there was no particular question which was raised to me.
There was one, Margit, specifically to you,
okay.
But there was one about from Carmen Real about gender studies under attack in Hungary. Can you say something about that?
Yes, certainly I have to. So gender studies is only one of the disciplines or sub-disciplines which is under attack. But I think this is a kind of new configuration under which we are working currently. So scholars working on these topics cannot be sure anytime that they will have the position of teaching or researching or research in the near future. So it doesn't mean that that our lives are under risk. It means that our profession is at the risk. Which is also true in our relationship with the field, certainly. And I think it's also important that we have to face with, concerning my opinion, with the majority of our colleagues who are not committed to study political issues or not engaged scholars. So we have also to face somehow and to deal with this. So we are in a minority position in our, I would say, I don't know really very much about other countries. It can be different. Nevertheless, my impression is that those who are really engaged are in minority in anthropology, and not only in anthropology, but in other disciplines as well. This has also another consequence, which is a methodological consequence, because those who became committed somehow to do research in these fields, it can be often that they are not only anthropologists, but we have to contribute or to work together with sociologists, political scientists, and so on, which creates a situation of compromise, of doing less ethnographic work, more interviews, for example, in order to be somehow comprehensible for other scholars also. So I think this is important. So a possibility and also a chance in interdisciplinary work on topics which are important for us engaged scholars, let's say.
Thank you, Margit. I think this idea of interdisciplinarity and coming to questions from the multiple positionalities that different ways of looking at things give us is important. Maybe we'll come back to that as well. Maybe I turn to Mary, if you'd like to respond to any of the questions. It doesn't particularly matter whether it's addressed to you specifically or to the discussion as a whole. Mary?
Sure, there are a bunch of things I'd like to respond to. Hopefully I can do that quickly. So Maitri brought up this question of the kind of position of liberalism and the kind of the groups that wouldn't necessarily identify with liberalism, kind of finding that the common front against so-called populism. And so I just thought that I would mention that I think it's very important the way that that's happening, that there's a capture into a framework of liberalism which happens even when people are not necessarily intending that. So even the language of illiberalism presumes liberalism as its opposite. So that's something that, you know, is an interesting thing to consider. I wanted to quickly speak to giving voice to the marginalized as opposed to something like coming to voice, which is the way that Black feminists in the US have framed it, and how we might think about that relationality, right? Because giving voice to is in a sense the person in power kind of handing a space to an other, which may be necessary given the dynamics of power. But then I wonder, and maybe Nora, you could speak to this, is the question of how coming to voice, the dynamic of coming to voice might happen. I think your classroom example was a really great one. And then I wanted to just kind of mention that in that kind of relationships of power, as a person who hasn't enjoyed a secure academic job, it kind of also brings into question some of the power, other kinds of power relations that are going on. So I teach, when I have the luxury of teaching, I teach as an adjunct, as an unpaid adjunct, along with about 70% of the teaching faculty in the United States. So the conditions of power are still there in the classroom, but they're also affected by this very precarious role and pay that people like myself face. I got another job, which is the way that I do that, but many people actually try to live from adjuncting. So I wanted to just kind of point back to Mariya's, you know, mentioning of the class war in the university as kind of one of the dynamics that's going on, and that can also be brought into the classroom in terms of the kinds of co-research we can do with students. And so I really enjoyed Nora's comments on that and thinking about researching the conditions of the university in addition to things like the museum and so on. So decolonizing the university is also very much about the relationships in the classroom as well as the kinds of knowledge production we do there and the relations of power in that knowledge production. Just a couple of other things I wanted to address. Someone asked about my distinction between good and bad nationalisms, and they added in the ugly. I'm not sure how I can address good, bad, and ugly nationalisms in any kind of detail, but I guess the thing I'm trying to point out is that all nationalisms share basic tenets, and that is that a state is informed by its responsibility to a nation. And in the process of that nation state coming to take responsibility for its nation, it actually it cultivates national affect, which may have been there before in some kind of movement or may not have been there before. But I think we have to be willing to reckon with the similarities between these nationalisms that we somehow think are good and those nationalisms that we can all call ugly, right? And part of that is the bigger history of capitalism and the global system, in my opinion, but I won't pontificate about that right now. I do think it relates to Margit's point about you know, a lack of interest of deep research into the right or something like that in Eastern Europe, and the fact that in many parts of Eastern Europe, the tradition of national ethnography is dominant in the field of what we call anthropology. And I don't want to hierarchize this as an evolutionary phase that they haven't gotten to social anthropology yet, because that's not my point at all. But it's a very different premise for a discipline, and it ties precisely with what I'm talking about, which is the production of the nation. And that is also in a global set of relationships of nations having to prove themselves or I should say, social groups having to prove themselves as deserving of a state and self-governance. And so we have to be able to look at that relationality there when we think about nationalism. Just a last comment would be to Hayal on your problematic. I think it's a really, really important thing that you raise. And there's a person also from who researches Turkey and Germany comparatively, especially around the arts and the way in which the arts culturalize groups in certain ways that make it hard to talk comparatively about them because they're asked to exceptionalize those groups. That's Banu Karaca. So you might look at some of her work in terms of how to negotiate this. But I would say that the strongest way to negotiate this is in addition to pointing out the specificities, to point out the shared characteristics. So if you talk about the history of modern policing, even if you just gesture to the history of modern policing or vigilante policing, because I saw your note later on, in a global sense, I think that it would be really great to be able to point to the larger global processes that produce these things while you're also speaking to the specificities. And I think you can do that. And it makes your arguments stronger, but it also allows us to produce those solidarities that we've been speaking about better. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you for listening and for asking and commenting.
Thank you, Mary. I turn also now to Nora for reflections on any of the questions and the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much for all these questions, but also I'm reading on the side, there's a whole conversation going on and it's super interesting. Also the different points that are made. Maybe I'll start by answering Alexandra's question on the potentialities but limits of studying up for undoing whiteness and asymmetries in knowledge production and politics. I don't really have an answer to that, besides maybe saying, I mean, pointing to work on the EU that has also mentioned how the EU, for example, on migration policies has been funded a lot of research that is critical of its migration policies, but then disregarding this research. It's a short article by Céline Kanta and Barak Kalir that I can also put in the link. It's called Fund But Disregard. And it's super interesting on this matter. But also I think sometimes just pointing to this whiteness could be useful. And there's actually, I mean, if you know research on this, I'm interested in it, but I haven't come across it on the whiteness of EU institutions. It's very, very striking when you go to Brussels. And I think just, you know, going there and maybe, you know, research specific to that point should be made on why people from a diversity of minorities are not interested maybe in jobs in Brussels, or maybe don't get there one way or the other. And also for Hayal's comment, I find extremely interesting in Rosana's answer of having to play the role of the scholar at risk in different contexts. In migration policy, there is a tendency to separate liberal context from illiberal context, although migration policies are very similar and increasingly similar in different contexts, and the most restrictive aspects don't always, you know, come in the way you would expect them. So yes, I think comparison is a really good tool. People have been mentioning this in the discussion, although it's been done, but you know, maybe questioning these categories and how they're used in research. But I think another interesting space or way to look at things is also looking at transnational spaces and circulations. And for example, for the far right, I think Agnieszka's work that has been mentioned before, she also looks, I think, at these international festivals of the far right. So, you know, there are transnational spaces for these nationalist forces as well. And it's really interesting to also look at these, at this dimension.
Sorry, I was just reading the comments. Thank you, Nora. One of the comments that came just now takes note about how people who are every rights, they write that as an intersectionally marginalized person, I found that I'm only invited to speak on issues of my identity and never asked to speak on my actual research topic. And I think this connects to the discussion that that has been going on about whiteness and the performance of whiteness and who passes that whiteness, and how whiteness often means a certain neutrality, the ability to pass through barriers and to pass through panels and conferences in very specific ways. I wonder whether anyone would like to speak to the issue of precarity and how this all connects. I mean, I think one thing which became very clear to us as we were bringing this panel together, many of the panelists encounter some form of academic precarity. And I wonder whether any of the panelists would like to elaborate a little bit on that and its connections to knowledge production, knowledge dissemination, and limitations of academia.
Maybe something to just note before we go to that is that I'm kind of really enjoying the fact that so far most of the people writing in the comments and all the people that came on stage are women and usually early career and precarious academics. And this is actually very exceptional, and we didn't think that, we didn't design it like this. We didn't call on people to do that, but it's actually quite nice to see it, because it's usually so difficult for this kind of subversion to happen. So I'm personally feeling quite humbled and quite happy to see that. I know Agnieszka, it's not exceptional for women to be in precarious positions. That's partly what my work is about. So I do a lot on precarity. I was telling Prem that he should stop me from speaking about it, because that would take a long time. So I would prefer if somebody else can say something about that. But I do think, just to address another comment maybe that Prem made was, I really like the work of Claudio Lomnitz on the fact of, core, like intellectuals in the core hubs of knowledge production being able to utter universal truths, and people in the periphery, in different peripheral positions, only being able to speak whatever is said from their own positionality and particularity. So you're always kind of siloed into your particularity rather than being allowed to articulate big issues and questions. And I think that's one of the limitations. You're sliced down. Someone said about this, being always the second-hand, the informant within the peripheral context. I think Nora said that, whereby you're not, like, if you're a Bulgarian, as I am, you're an interlocutor of big global scholars that come to Bulgaria, and you're their fixers to do stuff on the ground, but you're not actually, even if you make some kind of part of the theoretical framework, you're never really acknowledged for that, or you're ever the second, third, fifth author, because they're the ones that know the big theory. And I think that also reproduces academic precarity and peripherality within academia. So that is, I think, just something to also bear in mind.
Nora, please.
Yeah, it's not exactly about precarity per se, but it connects this status of informant or local fixer to this issue of precarity. There's an article in Antipode that came out, I think, about a year ago on the industry, the research industry on Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and that talks about the work conditions of research assistants, local research assistants, who often do a lot of the work and are not, they don't get authorship. So they get paid a local salary, which is probably fine, but also the issue of authorship is very important, and authorship is not shared. So the funding by project also emphasizes these type of projects that are really trendy, leading also to a certain research fatigue, I think, among certain populations that are kind of overstudied. But it also has consequences for the people who work on these projects in different places. I can put the link to the article.
I think we only have 5 minutes left, so I would probably just ask Mary, Margit, Nora, Prem, maybe Prem, you can say something as well, to just kind of, do a quick wrap up of the main points. I think it would be by now quite difficult to bring someone new because that would require a next round, and we are all absolutely exhausted by this fantastic conference so far. So we would be happy. I mean, I'm just kind of giving my concluding remark, saying I would be happy to see you and to chat to you more in the social event afterwards. You can look for most of us or on social media, except for Mary, who's a Luddite, but you can follow also leftists, you can follow us, and you can, you know, I'm sure we will have more opportunities to actually engage, and it's been a great conversation. So I just like now leave to everybody else.
I'd like to give space to Margit, Nora, Mary. Rosana's gone. If any last thoughts? I mean, from me, what I've done today, besides being at the conference, is I have a reading group with some of my students, and we were reading Audre Lorde, Sister Outsider. And one of my students who was here, but he disappeared, he made this very simple point that the issue about, the point that Avery made about people being called to speak to the identity, and identity is also simultaneously marginalized. And as they speak to that identity, it reinforces that marginalization. It's not just a question of academic knowledge, it's a question of survival. And for me, I think that's one of the things that's very important in these types of panels. I don't know how well we succeed in doing this, but it's about giving space for the rearticulation of positionalities and capacities to speak, and to ensure that certain positions and identities and politics survive in the midst of an overriding, dominating, hegemonic process. That's all that I want to say. Any thoughts from anyone else? Mariya, you want to say goodbye?
I think I said goodbye. I'm really grateful to Margit, Nora, Mary, and Rosana for coming and doing this with us. Despite their initial surprise, I think they actually managed to show what we were convinced all along, that we all have a lot to say, and that speaking out of all these peripheries and margins is extremely valuable, and we have to keep this space, as someone in the chat said. So thank you, everybody, and see you in the drinks. Thanks, everybody, for bearing with us at EASA, and I think I'm expressing at present the gratefulness from the EASA exec as well to Nomad IT, who have been with us all along, despite the fact that they've been overworked and totally exhausted. So thanks, Ro, and thanks to your whole team for that. And well, to the next EASA, and let's hope that would be a live one. Mary, do you want to say something? You have to unmute yourself. Unmute.
Since Mariya raised my Luddite status, I just wanted to say that I put my email in the chat to anyone who would like, condescend to send an email. If you want to be in touch, it's there.
Great.
And the chat will disappear. I've saved it. I don't know if you would like it, please email me and I can send it around, or we'll figure out another way of sending it around, because there's some really interesting things that came up there. Because as soon as you hang up, it will disappear, but I've saved it and I'll copy paste it somewhere.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone. We're gonna now leave, and that's gonna disappear the whole panel. So have a nice evening and hope to see you at the drinks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.